Give us today our daily bread. To understand the significance of bread in Jesus' prayer, it helps actually to begin with the fish. As I mentioned earlier, if you read any of the Gospels or if you listen to its stories long enough, you'll notice that Jesus engages in a lot of fishy business. Right? He's seldom far from boats and nets, from fish and fishermen. In fact, he's seldom far from the Sea of Galilee. And during Jesus' lifetime, the Sea of Galilee, the villages around it, those whose lives depended on it for jobs, for food, they were also undergoing a dramatic change. Because you see, the ruler of the region, Antipas, who had John beheaded, had ambitions to expand his domain and rule like his father, King Herod the Great, who ruled the region when Jesus was born, but died shortly thereafter, leaving it to his sons. And Herod the Great had been a ruthless leader who attained power by doing whatever it took, and for which he was willing to kill pretty much anybody who threatened it, which infamously included one of his wives, his mother-in-law, and even his sons. But still, you could say that Herod accomplished a great deal while in power. I mean, sure, he enhanced his own wealth through a system of taxation that favored the rich and drew disproportionately from the poor. But development and employment were at highs. New cities were founded. State-of-the-art harbors were built. And so Antipas took a play out of his father's playbook, and he sought to ingratiate himself to the Roman emperor of the time, Tiberius. Dictators love having things named after them. And so like his father, he issued a royal decree, and with the strike of his pen, Antipas declared that this piece of land along the western shore of the Sea of Galilee was now his and would be developed into a new and magnificent capital city. It was to be a crown jewel of the region. He was going to rename that city. He was going to name that city and rename the sea on which it sat Tiberius, in honor of the emperor. Because again, emperors like it when you cozy up to them by enhancing their status. But such infatuating favor was just the beginning. The real reason that Antipas built this new city on the sea, renamed the Sea of Galilee the Sea of Tiberius, the real reason for that was to commercialize its fishing industry, which in effect was to exploit the fishermen, whose financial situation was already tenuous and uncertain. Like subsistence farmers, these fishermen already struggled to catch enough just to keep food on the table, to pay the taxes that already existed. But by commercializing fishing, Antipas could create a whole new set of exports and a whole new tax base along with it. As the renowned biblical scholar John Dominic Crossan has written, there were probably at this point taxes for every stage of fishing, for having a boat, for fishing with drag nets, which was the common way of fishing, throwing out the net, pulling it back in. Maybe even for casting from shore itself. And you might also have to sell your catch to Antipas's new warehouses for storage. Imagine, Crossan adds, what these plans did to peasant fishers and their villages along the lake. Sure, Antipas miraculously multiplied the fish of the sea. Well, for the kingdom of Rome, at least. And at the expense of the people, over 95% of whom were poor. Over 95% of whose daily bread, which in the biblical world was not only a staple of their diet, but it was a simple way of saying food. People whose food for the day was not at all guaranteed. So imagine in these days your livelihood is changing, being upended day by day, month by month. Imagine waking up each day and not knowing what news you'd be learning. how your life and the life of your family was about to change. And you, utterly powerless to do anything about it. All of this was unfolding rapidly in the immediate years leading up to the start of Jesus' own ministry. And so it's worth remembering that most of Jesus' disciples came from these villages. Amidst their desperation, it's a little more understandable how when Jesus called them to new possibilities, they may have simply dropped their nets and followed him. What was the alternative? Jesus calls fishermen along the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias. Got to keep keep updating that map in my mind, I guess. He calls fishermen whose livelihoods have been upended by Antipas's economic development plans, who are now living with crushing taxes that have effectively renders them at, again, subsistence level. That is, they are working long hours and struggling just to put food on the table, to have enough for the day, not to mention the days ahead, to actually be able to plan out with any certainty or security. And what if they get behind? There's no forgiveness for those in debt in this system. Imagine that daily anxiety, the gripping fear, the overwhelm, the shame of coming home to your family with nothing to show for your efforts, not able to put food on the table to provide. Like that was your main duty. And every day you could fail. Though it'd be no fault of your own, it still makes you feel worthless, doesn't it? Like, forget hopes for the future. I'm just trying to make it day to day. And perhaps your own family and their own fear and anxiety about just surviving, they start to turn on you and blame you. You can't even provide for us? What good are you? It's easy to start blaming each other. But it's not that with Jesus their lives were secure or easy. Jesus expected much of them as well. And we know that Antipas did not care for Jesus, that he saw him as troubled, just like John the Baptizer, with whom Jesus was closely associated. And again, who just before this morning's gospel reading of the feeding of the 5,000, we learn was arrested and beheaded for daring to challenge this wannabe king. Following Jesus did not make their lives certain or easy or comfortable or secure. But amidst such uncertainty and change, it certainly gave them more purpose and direction when they were feeling utterless. It certainly gave them something to put their hands to, a way to resist the tyranny and the feeling of powerlessness. Give us today the bread that we need to make it to tomorrow. This prayer comes from and is given to those who are deep in the anxiety of survival, those who are overwhelmed by edicts they cannot control, by a system of enforcement that renders them powerless and their lives disposable. And again, Antipas and the kingdom of Rome, which he represents, they seek to divide and conquer. That is, they seek to use that anxiety that it causes in each of us to pit one group against another. So they spend all of their energy blaming each other, fighting each other for the scraps, rather than banding together to resist the real source of their oppression, what the Bible elsewhere calls the powers and principalities of the world. Antipas, the kingdom of Rome, and its oppressive structures. Knowing that, living deep in that reality, crushed beneath that as Jesus was, as those around him were. Jesus gives them this prayer to pray. Not just for themselves in a sort of capitalistic kind of way, but for their neighbors as well. Give us the bread that we need to make it, all of us who share this common lot of anxiety in this economy. Right? It's not a prayer that seeks its own fulfillment for oneself. Give me enough for me to get through the day and make it to tomorrow, or my family. It is personal, but it is also, as we've seen time and time again throughout this prayer that Jesus gives us, it is collective, fundamentally collective. Antipas wants them to fight for scraps. Jesus is calling them to share the scraps that they have and to trust that somehow it will be enough. Which brings us to the feeding of the 5,000 near the Sea of Tiberias. Jesus is gathered there with thousands of fellow hungry Jews late in the evening. And they are starting, I can imagine, to get agitated, hangry. They have no bread of their own. And Jesus, feeling compassion for them, knowing they have no shepherd, they are like sheep without a shepherd, they are like people with no one to lead them, to guide them, certainly not Antipas. He decides to offer them some bread of his own. But whereas the disciples turn to him and say, you know what, Jesus, it's getting late, let's just call it quits. Send them away so they can each go buy their own bread. That's probably what any of us would say, right? That sounds reasonable, I guess. But Jesus responds by saying, nah, how about you give them something to eat? We can imagine the expressions on their faces, right? Jesus, I'm not sure you're feeling so well, but how the heck are we, your disciples, supposed to feed 5,000 people? It would take 8 months' worth of wages to feed them just this one meal. Oh, what makes you think any of us have that kind of money? We wouldn't be following you probably if we did. So turning to his disciples, he asks them, well, okay, how much food do we have? 5 loaves? I mean, we're talking average loaves. These weren't like, somehow miraculously 1,000-pound loaves. We got 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus. Make it make sense. All they could see was scarcity. 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus responds. Perfect. Seeing instead, not scraps, but God's abundance. I mean, sure, they were still scraps, but he takes those loaves, and in an act that we continue to commemorate every time we do communion, he took those loaves and he gave thanks for them. He blessed them and he broke them and he took them. He gave them to his disciples and he said, feed my people. Give them to the people. And in what is surely meant to evoke, again, that grand story that we've been exploring this whole series, the Jewish story, the quintessential Jewish story of the Exodus, the liberation of the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt to a land of covenant and justice. All ate and had their fill. And I'll insist that the point here is not just to focus on how Jesus somehow defied nature and multiplied bread and argue whether or not this is possible and how did he miraculously go against the laws of nature, whether we can believe this literally, because to do that is to miss the truth of the story. What the Gospels are actually trying to convey, and which I think is actually harder to believe and to give ourselves to live, which is this. We don't know exactly what happened, and yet in the presence of Jesus and those he called, somehow people were fed and filled. And more than that, they were freed mentally and spiritually to live not from their fear, but from a place of faith, despite the overwhelm of Antipas's policies and the realities that they were all navigating. To live from a place of trust, of their deepest values, even in the midst of scarcity. To break that bread and share it with their neighbor rather than hoarding it for themselves. Because here's the thing, you can be free, technically, and not be free at the same time. As the great 19th century Polish rabbi Menachem Mendel famously put it, referring back to that Exodus story, the people trying to get out of Egypt, not only out of Egypt, but into a new land to live in a new way. He said, it took one day to get the Israelites out of Egypt, but it took 40 years of wandering in the wilderness to get Egypt out of them. And that is what Jesus is trying to do for his disciples, for his followers, for us today, to literally feed us enough for today, yes, but even more, to free us to not live from the fear and to act on the anxiety that the bread of this world creates in us. To live from a deeper center, because anxiety, it warps our sense of reality. It shrinks our capacity to trust. Anxiety and fear shrinks our capacity to care for others, to listen and love through difficult times, because again, it puts us into, how do I get mine? And so as we wander through our own fear-filled and uncertain times, I think it's safe to say that the Israelites, they weren't alone in that struggle. The disciples, the masses gathered there with Jesus along the Sea of Tiberias, they weren't alone in that struggle. Jesus doesn't want to just give you enough bread for your next meal, though he does. He wants to get Egypt, he wants to get Rome, the bread of whatever force is gripping you, shrinking your capacity to live from a place of deep trust. He wants to get that out of you. As another great rabbi, Irving Greenberg, has written, in Judaism's teaching, the Exodus, this story from Egypt, it's not merely a one-time event. Rather, it is a norm by which all life should be judged and guided. It's an orienting event. It's a North Star on our continual struggle for freedom in every time and place. And so for Jews of every generation, it is as though we are the Israelites trying to get free, trying to get Egypt out of us. And so it is for us in this prayer that Jesus gave us. For these stories like this one from the Gospel of Mark, such that whether we are in Egypt or Babylon or Rome or Palestine, a province of Rome, or Russia or China or these United States, the people of God are called to never be completely comfortable in, to never fully mirror the empire in which we live. Pharaoh and his empire, Antipas, Caesar, the powers and principalities of this world, they will, in every generation, continue to run roughshod over creation. And so in every generation, God calls forth a new family of people to rise up, to imagine another realm whose reign is God, is love, and whose currency is trust and mutual care, and to live as citizens of that realm, even as we inhabit this one. Give us, all of your beloved children, the bread that we need for today, God. literal, physical bread, spiritual, emotional bread, bread to satisfy our souls and sustain us amidst the daily onslaught and overwhelm, so that we can continue to live as your people, free to love our neighbor, free to welcome the stranger, free to care for each other, rather than merely fight for the scraps or look out for ourselves. May it be so. Amen.